Welcome to the MLK Celebration Panel. I am Professor Eric Schmidt, Political Science Professor at Kentucky Wesleyan College. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel of local leaders on Dr. King's legacy and combating racism in the greater Davis County community. Our panelists today are Professor Daniel Kuthy, who is an Assistant Professor of Political Science at Brescia University. He has served in his current position for 5 years. He has taught courses at various universities in Georgia and Kentucky. He earned his BA in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia, his MA in International Studies from Old Dominion University, and his PhD in Political Science from Georgia State University. His research and publications include foreign policy, democratization, and democratic regimes. Father Larry Hostetter, president of Brescia University since 2007, excuse me. His doctorate in sacred theology from the Pontifical Lateran University in Rome in Christian ethics. Before becoming president, he taught courses in theology, including scripture, social justice, medical ethics, and general moral theology. When not working, he enjoys spending time with his dogs and being out of doors. Reverend Rhondalyn Randolph. Reverend Randolph is president of the Owensboro Davis County chapter of the NAACP, Reverend of Pleasant Point Baptist Church, and is also vice president of the Davis County Kentucky Educators Association. She received her bachelor's in interdisciplinary studies with an emphasis in sociology from WKU in 2017. She spends her spare time volunteering in the community and is the proud grandmother of 12. Welcome, panelists. We've collected questions from the Black student unions at Brescia and KWC and from the broader student communities as well. The first question I'll direct to Reverend Randolph. When you think of the legacy of Dr. King, what comes to mind and how does it influence the work that you do?
When I think of the legacy of Dr. King and what he contributed to our country and social justice issues, I think of the advancements that we have made because of his sacrifice. His perspective on nonviolent demonstration and also using the foundation of his Christian faith made the civil rights movement more acceptable to the general mainstream society. So when I think about the legacy that he has left, it is that he invited all peoples from all walks of life into the movement, and he showed the necessity of walking in love and showing that honoring humanity, people as being human beings, is important to us all, and it's vital to the success of our country because we're all a part of our country.
Professor Coofe, do you have anything to add to that? How does Dr. King's legacy affect your work?
Building on what Reverend Randolph said so eloquently, I really think that he showed an example of the massive numbers of people that are needed in order to accomplish a social movement. And he would, well, not only would have been, but was the first to point this out to us, that the efforts of somebody like our students today is equally important as those that are in the spotlight of a social movement like that. And that serving as an inspiration on how to build and draw people together and both make people uncomfortable in the right ways, but at the same time find a way to allow for them to see themselves as part of a movement that might initially have seemed threatening to them.
Father Hostetter? Oh, I don't think your mic is on.
Of course, that was going to happen to one of us at some point today. For me, the extraordinary legacy of Dr. King has always been his ability to effect change through nonviolent resistance, similar to what we just heard from Reverend Randolph. There are many different ways that people create change in society. I mean, people try to do it at gunpoint or with violence, and that may change things, but it doesn't change hearts. And I think Dr. King had the amazing ability over time, and I think he continues to affect this, of changing hearts. And ultimately, if you want real social change, yes, sometimes you have to change the laws. You definitely have to do that, and you have to change behaviors. But for it to be long lasting, hearts have to be changed. And I think that is something that he was able to do as an outgrowth of his own Christian faith, but also his study of Gandhi and other world religions and peace movements of nonviolent resistance. And for me, that'll always be the most important part of his legacy.
His legacy is enduring, and perhaps can speak to some of the big challenges that are facing us today. And what do you see? We'll start again with Reverend Randolph. What do you see as the biggest challenges and obstacles to combating racism in the Owensboro community?
The biggest challenges and obstacles that I see is convincing people that racism and inequity in our community is still prevalent. That addressing these issues is not done in a way of being confrontational or stirring up trouble, but it's a way for us to acknowledge the truth of how everyone is living. It makes a difference when you can sit down and express how you feel and talk about the state of our community, instead of sweeping our issues under the rug or even acting like they don't exist at all. Because if you look at the poverty that's in our community, the fact that we don't have a landlord's tenant act, and a lot of different issues that affect our children and also our women, which is disproportionately affected by these types of issues. I think that is the biggest challenge, and being able to stand in truth. We have two different realities that we're living in right now. And some people see the way things are one way, and some people see the way things are another way. So it's a demonstration of how there are two different Americas and two different justice systems. And I think it was demonstrated so clearly when we saw the pictures and the videos of the police presence on the insurrection that happened on January the 6th. And when you compare that to what took place during the Black Lives Matter protests, which were about 90% peaceful across the country over the summer, it shows that we truly have work to do, because those same types of issues in regard to over-policing and poverty and things like that, it happens here too. It's just we don't address those issues like we need to.
Professor Kuthy, would you like to add to that?
I suppose, like with all social problems, one of the biggest issues is lack of empathy and willingness to try to understand the issue from a perspective that might be uncomfortable and might point towards your own fault or complicity in the issues. Certainly the lack of real deep contacts among people has been something that, quite frankly, in the last 30 years in the United States has increased as the society has resegregated to some degree. I don't think the problems in Owensboro are necessarily really that different than the problems in so many other places around this country. But I suppose just an honest willingness to look at these things from a broad perspective, and at the same time take one's own feelings out of it as much as possible in examining, analyzing, and understanding, but at the same time bring one's feelings back into it and realizing the connection that we share with others and the responsibility we have towards others' interactions.
Yeah, Dr. King does speak powerfully to cultivating that sort of empathy. Father Hostetter, would you like to also add to this?
Sure. This is the one question I spent some time thinking about, because there's so many different ways that one could approach this. And I think what the previous two panelists started, I think, is exactly where the problem lies in our own community, is just simply a lack of awareness of what racism actually is, what systemic racism is, how our culture is without a doubt, at its root, there's white supremacy has been part of who we are. And I think one of the big problems is, and I can speak as a white male who's benefited from the privileges that come from that kind of a system, that it's a lack of appreciation that we all have a role to play in the system as it exists. We're all part of it. And so one of the big problems that I feel there is that people kind of feel like racism is somebody else's issue. I'm not racist, that's that person over there, without realizing, no, I'm part of a system that is inherently racist, that there's something we have to get at the very root of who we are, and explore that, deal with that, and to do so with a certain level of courage, because as Daniel said, it really kind of forces us to look at our own complicity. And it needs to be a community effort. And part of a community effort is recognizing that we have a role to play in this, in supporting a systemic racism, and also in making it better.
Well, that leads into our second or follow-up question, actually. Do you remain hopeful for our country and community, and why? So Father Hostetter, we'll start with you and follow up, right? Given that one of the obstacles that you articulated there, the greatest one, is a lack of recognition of problems, and specifically you pointed to a lack of recognition of individual complicity in a system of white supremacy. I was hoping you could elaborate on how we might remain hopeful given that particular obstacle.
Well, I'm an educator. I've been an educator all of my adult life. And I think by definition, we educators tend to be hopeful, optimistic people. I mean, why else would we do what we do in trying to teach the next generation if we didn't feel like that something better could come as a result of the next group of people that are going to take over and run things. And that's ultimately why I'm optimistic. I know our students. I know the students that we have here at Brescia, the students that I know you all have at Kentucky Wesleyan, at OCTC, and across the Commonwealth, are students who are waking up to the realities that we have to deal with. They're listening, they're engaged, they're wanting change, and they're inspired by people like Dr. King to affect positive change. And so ultimately my optimism is rooted in the next generation, and that I will do my best as an educator to help them to explore these issues and then to make a real difference and to make a real change.
Professor Kuthy, do you see a similar aspect of, educating the next generation as being a source of your hope?
Absolutely. I do definitely see a lot of positive signs in the young people that I interact with at Brescia. Some challenges they face, some that they're unaware of course, as with any generation. But I see more to be hopeful about than not. And of course, in the past couple of decades of coming, a couple of decades since I was in their position, it's been a bit of a mixture in how I viewed the world, but interacting with them over the past 5 years at Brescia, it has helped to make me a bit more optimistic, even if it's very cautiously, in realizing that, of course, we'll never see a perfect world, but maybe that there are more of them moving in a direction towards equality. And hopefully the momentum of this past year will be something real instead of just a flash of corporate statements and universities making token efforts. I'm hopeful that we as society will actually start to move a couple steps in the right direction.
Reverend, what do you see in your work as a source and cause for hope in the future?
When I think about the future, I'm hopeful because I see my grandchildren and the love that I pour into them. When I looked at the demonstrations from last summer, it wasn't just Black people, but it was people from all walks of life. standing for what is right, which means that the education that has been poured into these young people, because it was really our youth that were on the front lines, it's paying off. And the benefits of living in an integrated society is teaching them that how they live when they play basketball or sports with white, black, and different ethnicities, or they go to school with different people, and maybe how they were taught, or a stereotype of what that other person may have been told to them is not working out to be true, because they're building on these relationships. So we're able to know people on a more personal level. So when I look at how we're all working together across racial lines for the sake of justice and equality, that gives me hope, because I know people are ingesting it and they're making it part of their everyday life and part of their character.
I think that's one of the remarkable parts of Dr. King's legacy, is speaking to this level of how interpersonal connectedness, right, allows you to see the face of God in the other, and that will ultimately be what draws us towards a hopeful future. Professor or Father Hostetter, why don't we return to you and kind of an elaboration on this theme, asking what small steps regular people can take in their daily lives to combat racism. And again, specifically to your point about white privilege and systemic white supremacy, right? Is there a particular burden on white people in particular to take particular steps to combat racism? And if so, what are those steps? Your mic again.
Unmuted again. I think one way to answer that question is just to reflect on my own experience and journey in a lot of this, which involved listening to people. And this is true not just with issues with regard to race, but also women's issues, LGBTQ issues, of just requiring myself to sometimes stop talking. When you have been a teacher and you're a professor, you have a tendency to talk and actually stop and listen. And I have learned just an incredible amount from friends, acquaintances, and colleagues, just by not necessarily asking questions, but listening to their experience. And I think for a lot of white people, that may be an important piece of it, because we don't always, our social circles aren't necessarily connected to people who have a different perspective than we do, that maybe look different than we do, come from a different culture, have a different lifestyle, whatever it might be. And the best thing that we can do with any other human being that we encounter is to, first of all, accept them with love, and then be open. And we open ourselves to others by listening to them.
Professor Kuthy, can you echo those sentiments of openness and love as a small step to combat white supremacy?
Absolutely, as well as having a soft but thick skin, if that makes sense. So a thick skin towards things that we might hear that are, or figure out or find out that are uncomfortable, a willingness to pursue and try to find the truth as best we can, to the extent it exists, without concern about what that would mean for us. We get to that next step once we figure out what is. And being willing to approach things with an open mind, open ears, open eyes, and be tough enough to accept that, what we find out, and willing to make changes as needed. So that self-education is one of the biggest steps. And then a willingness to accept that we might need to accept institutional changes that provide us with fewer benefits, which is tough, especially for people that might come from a situation where they don't see themselves as privileged, or they aren't aware of benefits that they gain through unfair means, or in society.
From all perspectives, I think the challenges that face us in politics usually reduce down to questions about self-knowledge. Reverend Randolph, would you like to add anything to the question about what small steps we can take to improve, in our daily lives to combat racism?
First, personal accountability for how we contribute or benefit to sustaining structural racism or institutionalized racism. Like Father Hostetter and Mr. Kuthy just expressed, getting people to acknowledge how they contribute because they benefit from, their whiteness is really hard when you may be just as poor as your Black counterpart, because not everyone benefits in the same way, but you may benefit in another way. And I think once you come to a place where you are acknowledging, you can acknowledge your benefit. And for Blacks, and for whites, you have to find a way to become active and to begin to change those structures of inequality in our community, because it's one thing to acknowledge, where you benefit, or to acknowledge that you see the problem that's in front of you, but there is a sense of activity that should be the next step in that. I think it was Mother Teresa that says, be the change that you want to see in the world. So when you see that things need to be changed, first it starts with you. And then once it starts with you, you can begin to initiate that type of change in the greater community.
Is acknowledgement enough? Right. So if I were to press the issue a little bit here, right, we can verbally acknowledge, right, but plenty of people hold positions that maybe the three of you would aver are products of a white supremacist system. At what point should someone who feels they've benefited consider stepping down from a position that they've acquired through white supremacy?
Well, you can look at that in two ways. Maybe the answer may not be you stepping down. Maybe the answer may be is making a way for someone else, because you're in a position where maybe you could enact a change in someone else's life and improve the quality of someone else's life through your access. So it may not necessarily be you stepping down. It may be that you need to pull someone else up.
Good. I like that. Are there structural reforms, and continuing on this theme of concretely what can be done, speaking maybe more from the perspective of policy, what structural reforms, Reverend Randolph, would you like to see in terms of addressing public services to address racism, policing, social services, public transport? I think you mentioned the Landlord-Tenant Act earlier, if you would like to elaborate perhaps on that.
Yes, first I want to start off with things that I've mentioned outside of that, and programs or people that I've already reached out to, and that's the school system, the inequities and changes that need to take place within Owensboro Public Schools and Davis County Public Schools. I met with Mr. Constance over the summer, and they started a whole equity committee. And they know that a change is needed, but they did not necessarily know the steps, or maybe not in the past had the initiative to want to make that a priority to hire more minority teachers, or to tackle the challenge of minority kids being in trouble at a disproportionate rate. But the county school system has not prioritized it the same way the city school system has. It doesn't mean that it's not needed there. In fact, I would say that it's needed there more, because most of those kids don't have as much contact with minority individuals like city schools do. But another piece would be, or place to tackle institutionalized racism from a policy perspective, would be on the Landlord-Tenants Act, and how because people live in poverty, and poverty disproportionately affects women, more so Black women, which in turn affects Black children at a more disproportionate rate. So you have education that ties into the lack of opportunity, which ties into a person's economic status, which leads to poor living conditions. And if we, I know it seems really big, but it starts at a grassroots level on tackling those types of issues. So you have to put pressure on the school systems in order to get those equity changes done. And we also need to put pressure on lawmakers in order to pass things like the Landlord Tenants Act to make people's living conditions better. And then the fact of the arrest rate within our community is like 40% higher for African Americans. And it's been proven that we don't commit crimes at a higher rate than other races, but we are policed at a higher rate. So I would say, like, the police reform over the summer, the big thing was defund the police. I don't like the terminology, because if you don't have law and order, your society will go into chaos. But the way we look at policing may need to be changed in regard to how police officers are trained, the types of things that they are trained in, how many hours of training do they have that teach the communication skills in order to interact with people in the community, and such things as the no-knock warrants. And Breonna's law that's trying to be passed. I think that's Senate Bill 21. It's things like that many people have to be involved in this. So these are some ways that those policy changes can have a great impact for the better on the minority community.
Professor Kuthy, would you like to add to that? Structural reforms in policing, social services, and public transit, et cetera. Is there anything in particular that you'd like to emphasize?
Sure, and I don't proclaim any great expertise in this area, but certainly education and the justice system would be two of those areas that I would especially like to see some efforts, whether it has to do with disproportionate disciplinary actions taken against students, increasing ability of the students to see opportunity for themselves and a place for themselves in the society that isn't limited, to try to address, and I think many school systems have really tried to address the underlying systemic things that are preventing students from becoming better educated, whether it's nutrition, whether it's housing, whether it's support at home, where some parents are better able to provide that than others. That the level of privilege and lack of privilege is deeper and multifaceted in a lot of ways. And within the justice system, there are a lot of ways to, at a minimum, stop making things worse, such as Reverend Randolph mentions, the over-policing of Black communities, the work within the justice system, prosecution, to try to make this more equitable, the incentives provided. And part of that has to do with and changing the norms in the voters and how they reward the public officials in their actions, because there is a high degree of benefit in touting a law and order platform. And of course, who among us doesn't like law and order, right? But that often is a cover for, that is often is just packaged as getting tough, so to say, and sold in a way that's attractive to the public. So unfortunately, in a democratic society, a lot of this doesn't work unless there's grassroots mobilization to elect people to school boards that are going to make different decisions when it comes to picking the superintendents, the principals, and making policies, because so often the school board elections get so little attention. We saw this year, right? Whereas it actually is a position for profound importance, more attention to the local political positions, and more mobilization around those rather than the presidential elections that are so distant and where, quite frankly, Kentucky's going to vote how Kentucky's going to vote. But at the local level elections, there's real opportunity to put greater scrutiny there for those of us in the public that can vote or volunteer or even just talk to friends, even if we're not citizens, and try and convince them, hey, you should vote for this person for these reasons.
Local aspect is certainly deeply important. All politics is local to a large extent. Father Hostetter, would you like to add anything specific about structural reforms that you'd like to see?
I think this is a good question that follows up with your previous question, Professor Schmidt, about whether white people who have authority should step down to let other people have a chance or be part of the system. I'm not so sure it's about stepping down as it is stepping back. And this is a great example of that. I've personally never experienced the consequences of structural racism. So I'm not sure I'm the one that should be setting the agenda for how to change the structures. Instead, in my position, I feel like that's an area where I need to step back and hear the voices such as Reverend Randolph's of what the issues are from people who've experienced firsthand the effects of structural racism, and then to do my part in helping to make the change, using then the position that I have to actually create some change. So yes, there's lots that need to be done. It needs to be done in terms of the structures and how we might change them. And I think Reverend Randolph and Dr. Kuthy have done a great job of articulating those. But I think my role as the president of a university in this case is not necessarily to set that agenda, but to step back, let somebody else say what the issues are. I'm not the one that needs to say what the problems are, but then once those problems have been identified, step up and help solve them.
Good, I like that
If I
answer.
can I interject, Eric?
Of course.
A perfect example of that is when we started the Confederate statue removal campaign off the courthouse lawn. And when we partnered with formed our coalition partners were people in prominent positions, but they may not necessarily would have taken the lead in something like that as a campaign to show that it's a divisive issue, but it's a necessary issue to face because it's part of and a symbol of structural and institutionalized racism. So like when our educational coalition partners and when, the Human Relations Commission and the Black Expo, and city and county government, they may not have taken the head role, but they were able to get people's attention because of their participation we wouldn't otherwise had the attention of, and maybe not had gained the momentum to get the unanimous vote for it to be removed. So it wasn't that they stepped down, but they did what he said. They stepped back and they pulled me and Nahid or, Black Expo into a position where we had the ear of people that we would not had the ear of, So that's a way that, us partnering up to stand for what is right can really make an impact on a grassroots level on our local institutional symbols and policies that are systematically racist because it disproportionately affects people like me.
I think this speaks to Dr. King's legacy. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, he lays out a procedure almost for nonviolent action that includes data collection, negotiation, purification, self-purification, and direct action. All right, and though he discusses it in almost a sort of linear way, the way you three discussed it here is that they're all kind of taking place simultaneously. Father Hostetter speaking to self-purification, the controversy in removing the statue, and Owensboro to negotiation, right? Data collection, speaking to the community, and of course the nonviolent action to show the support from the grassroots level. I think all three of you have spoken powerfully to that particular articulation from Dr. King himself, right, about how to practice nonviolent advocacy. We'll go then to Father Hostetter here. We'll start asking, since we are a higher ed community, do you believe that higher education is doing enough to address diversity and equity in Owensboro? And if not, what would you like to see us do? The microphone.
Yeah, I think that's my age showing. I can speak for Brescia, and I can say, no, we are not doing enough yet. I'm not sure when we will ever be able to do enough, given the legacy of systemic racism in our country, and that's not something that's going to be fixed quickly. So we have taken some time. We just released a new strategic plan, and we've made diversity a central part of that plan, as do a lot of colleges and universities. Diversity is always important to colleges and universities, but we wanted to be sure it was something that actually was connected to action. And so we're looking at our entire university and trying to take the concept of universal design and ask ourselves, what are the barriers that prevent our students from learning? And yes, there are barriers that come with culture and race. And what are we doing that prevent our students from learning, whatever perspective they might be coming from? And we recognize that, given where we are in the United States and our history of racism, that racism itself is a barrier to education. So how do we eliminate that? And from my perspective, one of the things that we're really focused on just this semester is looking at our hiring practices and asking the question, how can we make sure that we have more representation of people of color on our staff and in our faculty, as well as in our students. But we've got a fairly diverse student population, but I can't say the same thing about our faculty and staff. And I've for years I was one of these folks that would say, yes, we want to have a diverse staff, we want to have a diverse faculty, but nobody's applying. When we put that out there, we put our equal opportunity statement out there, and somebody really challenged me. This is an example of that listening, and a colleague challenged me and said, that's really just an excuse. And that really kind of hit me on upside the head and made me think that, yeah, that really is, and it's one that we often use in whatever business that we're in, but especially in higher ed. And so, we began exploring how do we actually then hire for diversity, and that there are actually some practices that one can put in place and policies that one can put into place that are beyond just, in the ad that you put out that we're an equal opportunity employer. And I'm really interested to see how that develops. I can't say I know enough about it, honestly, yet to know how we're going to do that. It's something we're putting into place right now, but that's just one example of how one institution of higher education can help address the issues of diversity and equity in Owensboro. And that is just one step. That can't be all of it, obviously. But the way I look at it is, if we can increase the diversity on our faculty and staff, then those voices will change the culture of the institution, because there will be a more diverse set of voices. And it's the voices, especially in an institution of higher ed, it's the faculty and staff and not the administration that shape the culture of the institution. And so by doing that, I see our institution becoming more diverse and more equitable over time. And I think that's something that maybe other institutions could benefit from as well.
Professor Kuthy, would you like to add to those sentiments?
Yes, and I'm glad to see the president of my university start with no, because otherwise this might be awkward. So no, but I am encouraged to actually see what are I think some real steps that are more than lip service, and the start of realization from the top. I hope, and I think that at least with some institutions around the country, this has been there more than not this year. And I'm hopeful that some momentum will carry behind this. Ultimately, we need to deepen and broaden the buy-in and commitment to this at Brescia, and I'm sure at other schools as well, because of reactions to resistance that I've seen quite often from quite a few people that aren't bad people, but that are either unaware of or unwilling to see obstacles to equity that exist. And it's not easy. And one of the tricky things, and I don't have an easy answer for this, is how to encourage empowerment to speak up among our students about their experience in an honest way, because the typical inclination of a lot of people is to try to get by, not ruffle feathers. So how do we create a culture in which people are comfortable with voicing those concerns honestly and openly, in a way that is not there to be punitive towards people, but to improve the culture and actions of everybody at the university? Because there are many obstacles that we put in place unwillingly through things that we think are neutral, such as, for example, we can easily look at census data and see the demographics of Owensboro, right? It's less diverse than our student population. That's an obstacle that exists. And there are real monetary challenges, but for example, the question of, do we agree to pay for travel for people interviewing for more positions in order to encourage that? How do we diversify application pools in faculty and staff positions? Because so much of it's based on social connections. So there's a hand-down effect there in terms of social networks, connections, that if you have more white people at a school and they are more likely to interact and socialize with and have professional networks that are disproportionately white, you're going to have an applicant pool that's disproportionately white if you don't take active steps to address that. And it's not just race, of course. Place as well matters and all sorts of things. So how do we, one, work to build the buy-in broadly and deeply as much as we can? And of course, we're not going to get there with everybody. And how is it that we create an environment where people are comfortable in expressing these views that might ruffle feathers, and find networks, routes, and methods to allow that among faculty, staff, and students, or students, staff, and faculty? Because it goes in that faculty, staff, and student order a little too much, perhaps, in how we say it.
Yeah, I can echo some of those sentiments from what I've seen at KWC, right? Very similar challenges that we're facing and trying to approach with new eyes and fresh perspectives as well. I think both of you articulated that perspective very well, but from a perspective outside of higher education. Reverend Randolph, is there anything you'd like to add about what higher education is doing to address questions of diversity and equity?
Well, no, because I'm not in higher education per se, but I do have a couple of ideas of how they could become more involved in the community at large. A way that they could foster talent is to be more involved in our local school systems and community centers, and have a better presence in that way, and make those connections and build upon those relationships. And you'd be surprised at how kids, it'll boomerang back, and maybe pick your institution to attend. I was so pleased when KWC asked for the NAACP to participate in the Bonner grant that the student unions worked on. And the avenue that they chose was to work with high school students on the importance of being involved in your community and the responsibility in civics. and voting and understanding the political process. And I'm excited about working with them on that. But these are kind of like recent events, I say, within the last 2 or 3 years that I've seen or have had that contact where they're reaching out to members in the community to join in and partner in, because the fresh ideas that students have, it could really be beneficial to building in the community, building those relationships and programming and making the lives of kids and communities better.
I've worked with some of those Bonner Grant programs too, and I really like what you said about, what the students can bring to the situation, right? In terms of speaking of fresh perspectives. And it leads us to our last question here, and I'll start with Professor Kuthy for this last question. Is advice. The students have asked for what advice you would give to college students trying to navigate the current climate in our community and country. And I think, the current climate speaks to, in this case, both race and politics, et cetera. So if you could maybe offer some learned advice from the perspective of a political science professor.
I don't know how learned it will be, but one would be to simply start with empathy for those that you're engaging with, to realize that their perspective is likely not your own, and to try to understand that in some ways we're all victims of an unequal society in certain ways. And I remember this as something that John Lewis said very powerfully, that it's in him speaking about the power of looking at the person that's beating him, sicking the dogs on him, and realize that they are also victims of an oppressive system.
I love
and of
that.
course, and fortunately, we don't deal with quite such extremes at Brescia. But at the same time, realizing that everybody, has somebody that loves them and deserves to be loved, and to try to, acknowledge that perspective and humanity and engaging with them. Also to not be afraid to stand up and, for your own rights, your own place, your own seat at the table, and try to think about what's the best way to advocate for yourself and others, and be willing to do that and not be afraid to do so.
Father Hostetter? The microphone.
I might learn yet before this is all over. This was for me maybe one of the toughest of these questions, because it gets at the very heart of what we do as a university. I tell our students, and I think the same is true at Wesleyan, that our faculty and staff, our administration, we have a real sense, I believe, of a vocation for teaching. We recognize that when we encounter our students, they're on a path of their life, and for some reason their path intersected with our path, and at that moment of intersection something incredible is happening that we call education. But it's more than just learning a bunch of stuff. It's about becoming the best person that you can be. And as I see my students, our students, this summer and in the spring, and just struggling with fear because of what they see in the country, and the when racism kind of rears its ugly head. I mean, and for some of them, it may be the first time they've experienced it at that intense of a level, or the first time they've had an opportunity to reflect on it as adults. I'm sure as children they've probably had that and they can look back, but there comes a point where you start thinking about things as an adult. And I think what Daniel said about empathy is so important, but also to allow them to be angry. Thinking especially of our minority students, that it's okay. You don't have to jump to forgiveness, because I think I hear that often. And as a Christian, forgiveness is at the core of who I am. But I think that our students can recognize and can that forgiveness is all, accountability is a part of forgiveness, and part of what I hope they learn that they can hold us accountable, that they can remind us of what's important, they can remind us of justice, and they don't have to say, oh, it's okay, because it might not be okay. And they might need to process this through some anger and maybe even rejection of what I hold as important, as part of the process of working through all of this. Ultimately, I hope everybody comes to the point of forgiveness, because I think it benefits you personally more so than it does an offender. But this really, I guess what I'm getting at is this really goes beyond just an education in terms of learning a bunch of stuff. This really comes down to helping our students to be resilient, but in a way that leads to positive change and to greater justice.
Reverend Randolph, would you like to add any advice for college students?
There is a delay on this last segment for me. I don't know if it's because of my internet. So I was getting bits and pieces of what the other speaker said. Could you repeat the question?
The question is general advice that you'd have to offer college students and how they may navigate the current political, cultural climate that they face today, both on campus, but also in the community and in the country at large.
Yeah, this current situation, it really struck me to my core, because I really do believe in God first, in our country, and the importance of us all working together. And I hope it serves as an example of the importance of understanding the political process, being able to decipher what is truth for you, what is truth, being able to go through facts in a balanced way, and the importance of being involved in your local community, because the world is not just you, and it's not just your little bubble, but the world is so much bigger than what you see. And being able to take all of the nuggets of what you have learned along the way, of these intersections that Father talked about, and people that you come across, it's not by chance. It's all for a purpose. And we have, as kids, you really don't understand how all of this is going to come together. But there will be junctures in life where you'll see the benefits of what you've previously learned, and being able to apply those things in real time is important. Some people never get to that point where they're able to apply what's up here in their head. And it takes a lot of forethought in what you invest. It takes knowing yourself and being true to yourself and how you want to live. This experience that we're having right now is, history in the making, that their kids will be learning from, in their history books. So the importance of knowing, what's taking place is what I would like to give to them, is in regards to what's happening right now politically.
I think that's good advice. We actually that concludes the questions that were given to us by the student body, the student bodies. So I think we'll conclude by asking each one of you if you have any summative thoughts you'd like to share about anything we've discussed thus far, or Dr. King's legacy. Father Hostetter, why don't we start with you? And the microphone. It's the last one.
Of course. Something I've been thinking about is, as a Christian, as an ordained priest, I think I have a certain responsibility to reflect on my own tradition and how we've either contributed or made things better, made things worse, made things better. And I think one of the things that maybe we as Christians, especially white Christians, need to really get a hold of is the contribution of Western Christianity's contribution to systemic racism, a theology specifically that saw the white person as superior, which of course led to colonialism, that the white person was somehow endowed by God with, extra grace, and so had to take care of everybody else. And that, like I said, led to colonialism. It's part of our own manifest destiny, that we somehow know better. And that was actually rooted in a certain theology. I mean, that somehow God is the one that ordained that. And I think we really need, I don't know if we've ever really reckoned with that, because that is not at the core of Christianity. You won't find that in the Gospels anywhere, as I think Reverend Randolph can attest to. And that perhaps one of the legacies of Dr. King is also this vision of Christianity not as an excuse to oppress others, but as the force of liberation, which is what it was meant to be. And I think that is part of his legacy. It is for me, as we reflect on our own, history and where we are and where we ought to be and where we might go in a future of hope.
In his letter from Birmingham jail, he reflects on his time walking through the streets in the South and looking at all the marvelous churches, the structures that have been built there. And he says that he asks himself, who are they who worship here? Right. And he says it with angst, right? He's very troubled by that. How do I reconcile that there are so many Christians here and yet amidst such injustice? Professor Kuthy, any summative thoughts you'd like to share in conclusion?
I think one thing that is a legacy of Dr. King, and quite frankly, the civil rights movement and other social movements that have challenged existing structures, is that laws are not always just, and following the law perfectly might not always be the answer, but challenging it. And that sometimes civil disobedience, nonviolent but unlawful civil disobedience, can be justified. And one of the legacies of Dr. King is that we as society have come to whitewash it somewhat, make it sound so peaceful, so acceptable. So, oh, of course this was right all along. When he, like Gandhi, like Jesus, and like so many others, challenged their society, often in disruptive, troubling, and unpopular ways. So that being in the majority isn't necessarily where you want to be, and especially not when it comes to looking at systemic, unjust structures.
I like that. It brings us back to the idea of self-purification being a necessary part for Dr. King of nonviolent action, the sort of preparation you have to do on the soul before you engage in such dramatic and important actions. The last word to you, Reverend Randolph.
From the NAACP, our celebration, we always contribute from the perspective that Martin Luther King was Reverend. He was a pastor, he was a preacher, he was a man of God. And he said that Sunday morning is the most segregated time in the country. And his legacy leaves that, each person is stamped with the image of God, and each human being is valuable. And until we start to see each other as in that manner, from a place of love, from a place of, purity, we have to really put in that work to move society forward to a more perfect society. And maybe we can come to the realizations of becoming a more perfect union. He contributed so much in that way, and that's why he ended at the latter part of his life. It was the Poor People's Campaign, because he brought in everybody. He brought in Native Americans, he brought in Hispanics, he brought in poor whites, and he brought in Blacks because he wanted to leave a legacy that it's all of us made in the image of God. All of us, all of humanity. There's no difference. We're all one race, and we're all fighting for basic things that we all want. So the only way to tackle the division is to tackle it in unity. And don't focus in on the person, but you focus in on the unjust practices or the institutionalized racism, the systematic racism, all the things that are holding us all back. Like Dr. Kuthy said, when you're looking at someone else, you have to understand that they are part of the oppressed. And until we come to that realization that we're all in this thing together, it's going to make it really hard to move forward. The division I see is just it hurts my heart. It really hurts my heart because those are things that God does not like. But his legacy that he left, the things that we honor with our local branch, is the preacher in him, is what I call it. The preacher in him, what Black folks call it, he's hooping and hollering, from the pulpit, but he is so passionate about what he's saying, and he's led by the Spirit of God, because that same thing that Father Hostetter talked about, Dr. Crohn's book, From the Cross to the Lynching Tree, when he talks about Christianity's responsibility. I'm getting kind of goosebumps now. Christianity's responsibility for the state that we are in right now. Until we acknowledge that and face our past, of the wrongs that we did to one another, to God's people, because we're all God's people, it's going to be hard to move forward. But it doesn't mean that we can't, because there's still hope. There is still hope. And like John Lewis said, you got to make some good trouble. You got to make some good trouble. So if we work together, like Dr. King ended his life with everybody. And there was an interview that I was watching that said in one of the last organizational meetings before they had the March on Washington, and he had bought in like everybody. And the Native American representatives that were there, he had asked, Dr. King had asked the Hispanic migrant workers to speak first, and the migrant workers said, no, I'm going to let the Native American representatives speak first, because after all, they were here before all of us. So it's that kind of acknowledgement of who you are, of what you have contributed. No more whitewashing, but standing in the truth of who we are as a nation, and all of our contributions that we have made to make us what we are now. That is a starting place for us to be. That's why I work so hard to get that statue off the courthouse lawn, because it's not truth. It's not allowing our community to stand in truth. That was a lie. It's a farce. And it's, someone's imagination of what happened, of their perspective of how they see it, but it's not truth. And in order for us to move forward, we have to begin to stand in truth, live in truth, and work together in truth.
Thank you, Reverend. I think that was a very appropriate way to close the panel today, a call to truth and unity. Thank you to all of the panelists for participating. The community will benefit from hearing what you had to say, and be on the lookout for more programming and events this week celebrating the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. With that, thank you and goodbye.